Welcome to episode 4 of the Social Web TV, the internet TV show that answers the question, who owns your data? With these two simple words, you do. All right, we are back for episode 4.
Back from F8.
Yes,
Yeah,
and what an
shooting
epic
on location. Yeah.
And this is episode 4, A New Hope.
Right.
And for this special episode, we are joined by a new panelist, Chris. So Open It Hurts Messina. Welcome.
Thank you.
Long last.
Yes, hello.
So this week we thought, rather than focus on a bunch of company announcements, and there have been plenty of them in recent weeks, that we really should take a look at some of the things that give us all hope, which is a new set of building blocks, open specs for a new version of the social web, one that is totally open.
I guess that's sort of the Rebel Alliance. So follow that analogy for it. Are we doing a Star Wars theme show?
Are we
here?
before or after the Death Star, or?
We don't have any
Thanks,
red
Luke.
lightsabers.
Yeah. Okay. Moving on.
Yeah, and we've obviously got some folks here with some deep experience in a number of the key building blocks, and we thought if we could just use this episode to introduce you to each of the key building blocks and give you a little bit of understanding of what each one of them does and how they might work together, and why you as a consumer might want to be interested in the success of these projects, that would be a real win. So who wants to start us off with a little intro?
I can actually take us back a little bit, basically because a lot of this came out of kind of a long-term project to build technologies, as Joseph likes to say, that are actually engineered for adoption. And the real premise behind that is realizing that enterprises that have this command and control type structure, very top down, are able to deploy very complicated, complex, high cost technologies because, of course, they're centralized and they have a lot of control. When it comes to the open web, though, a lot of the adoption of technology revolves around voluntary implementation. And especially where you have hobbyists or folks working in open source, you need to make this stuff, easy to sort of pick up in an afternoon, deploy something that actually does something interesting or cool, can impress the friends or the ladies or the boys, depending on your persuasion, and essentially show it off and then rev it really quickly. And so a while ago, Tantik Celik and Kevin Marks and some other folks sort of came up with this notion of, we've got all these web pages out there. We've got everyone not everyone, but there is a number of folks who, let's say, come out of high school understanding how to write web pages, HTML. Mm-hmm. Well, what if we could take all those web pages and turn those into sources of rich data? And that's sort of where the germination of this concept of microformats came from. And that's sort of one of the original building blocks, taken to old school, that we realized, well, if people already have these web pages, they're already marking up or they're already expressing, here's a person, here's an event, here's a review.
Like I go to your homepage, I see your contact information.
Or this is also,
here's some events I'm going at, but it's only meant for humans to consume. If I wanted to put that in my calendar and my address book, every web page is different, and it's hard to make them actually work together.
This is also the generation where people had blogs, and Technorati was sort of like, king of the hill.
Both Kevin and Tantik worked for Technorati.
This is also true. So there was obviously a benefit there where if you're working on a search engine, if you have richer data coming from the web, you can do interesting transformations on it. And it's also really interesting.
So microformats, what period of time are we talking about?
Like this is like 2005-ish.
Okay.
I mean, this is like old school.
Ancient history.
This is like,
The notion that you were talking about of the small building blocks wasn't really new for the underlying web infrastructure.
That's true.
Like you had things like HTTP and DNS and all of those of the small pieces loosely joined. I think what was sort of more unique about microformats at the time was bringing that into the HTML layer.
Well, and what's important about that, and I think this is really critical, is that HTML by default, because you had web browsers, graphical browsers, you could write up your microformats and actually see what the output would look like. And then you also had something like CSS where you could actually just create visual transformation based on the semantic markup that you're using. So there's that whole layer of benefit where you just deploy this stuff and people are looking at your actual code. It was like, my HTML now becomes my API. I don't have to do all this extra programming, nor do I have to build this application that demonstrates the value of making this data available. It's just visible, it's right there.
So in terms of end user value, what would be an example of why I, as a consumer, might want microformats to be more broadly adopted? How would I benefit?
I think there's a number of things right now, and we're sort of in a transitional period where some of it is we're waiting to see what's going to be done with this. On the other hand, there are applications or plugins for browsers, for example. I use one called a Safari Microformats plugin that actually detects like people in a web page and allows me to add them to my address book immediately, which is great when I'm on the go and I want to get someone's information into my phone, for
Or like
example.
we were just up at the OzCon conference last
Yeah,
week, and
yeah.
they've got on the website, here's where all the talks are. And because they're using microformats, if you have one of these plugins, you can just drop the events right into your calendar that you want to go to, and it'll all be formatted. So
And then microformats are also being used. A few episodes ago, we talked about Google's Social Graph API,
Yeah.
and they added a
Yeah.
new method there called the Other Me API, which allows you to start out saying, I know Chris is at factoryjoe.com, what are all of his other profiles? And that will actually use microformats and other semantic markup to give you information such as Chris's full name, his email address, any of that sort of stuff. Which
Whatever he chose to make public.
Exactly, anything that he
Yeah.
chose to make public.
Yeah, but there's also there's a couple of interesting points there, and again, this is looking at what people are already doing. So one of the great inventions of microformats that I think is actually or has contributed to other technologies that we worked on is the notion of sort of paving the cow paths. And that's not necessarily a new idea; it's a very old idea. But the idea is take a look at existing behavior in the wild and design technology that solves sort of 80% of those problems or use cases, and then drives more value. So in this case, if you go across any web or the web or someone's blog, more and more people have these little widgets now that say, oh, here's my Twitter account, here's my Last.fm account, here's Plaxo, blah, 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 like 40
Right.
different
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
And literally by adding, let's see, what is it, like 7 characters to each of those links.
just right in the
relative to me,
HTML where you're already
in
doing
the
it.
HTML where you're already publishing these links, you're now supporting microformats. And now you're also providing a machine-readable way for other applications to say, oh, and now I see Chris's accounts on all the other different services, and now we can actually do things like friending and stuff like that on the fly.
And that particular microformat is called XFN, and we'll provide a link to that as well.
And that, I mean, the cool thing now, I think, is that most blog software, if you're using it, or most consumer websites, if you're using LinkedIn or Plaxo or Twitter, all these things, they're putting in those microformats for you. So sometimes people think, oh, well, if I'm not a web hacker, can I really play in this new world? And the answer is, yeah, you absolutely can, and it's very easy. So that's exciting progress.
Cool. So let's go from there to getting the full set of building blocks out in front. So what happens after the microformat stuff?
So in 2005, well, yeah, so same year,
yeah, same time
summer
period.
of 2005, I was working for LiveJournal at the time, along with Brad Fitzpatrick, and SixApart had bought LiveJournal from him earlier that year. And one of the things that we ran into was that there wasn't a lot of spam within LiveJournal because the comments were all authenticated. So how could we start to do this across the web? And that's where OpenID was originally born from, of allowing a blogger to go and prove that they own this URL, oftentimes their blog, when going to comment somewhere else. OpenID has sort of grown a lot over the past few years, expanded beyond that, and I think now can be thought of as one of those underlying building blocks for identity online for the web.
Yeah.
And I think we're seeing things like that, of OpenID being combined with technologies like OAuth. Like MySpace is doing this, where you're using an OpenID from MySpace to get identity, and then using OAuth on top of that to get access to data APIs around profile information, friends information, all that sort of stuff as
So
well.
I think there you're making a reference to an announcement last week and some stuff still to come. At this moment in time, I can't necessarily go use my MySpace profile to do that, or can I?
I don't think it's live yet, but I think there's starting to be documentation about that.
But I think also just stepping back a moment, the web, generally speaking, is sort of public data, right? And so microformats was still sort of living in this world where whatever you choose to put up on the web for everyone to see, at least now there's an easy way to make it more useful and easier to do mashups. But obviously for a lot of people, when it comes to their contact information or who they know or what they're doing, they don't want to share that with everybody. And once you have a sort of, the great thing about the web is it's distributed. Everybody can put up their own web server. But when you start to want to say, oh, it's okay if Chris or David see that information, but I don't want everybody to see it, you have to answer the question, when Chris or David come to my website, how do they prove that they really are Chris or David so that I can share that information? So once you want to start doing non-public stuff, and really I think as much success as there's been on the sort of public Web 2.0 scene, it's really just the tip of the iceberg of what everybody wants to share.
Well, I
you
think-
have to start tackling those identity problems, and so OpenID is the first attempt to sort of do a real lightweight, web-scale, distributed identity solution. So rather than saying everybody has to get an account on X site or Y site, it's a way of saying I can show up and say, hey, I use Yahoo, or I use Plaxo, or I use my own website, and it all sort of works together.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's sort of an important notion of understanding what OpenID kind of does for you, and essentially that's allowing you to have some identifier. In this case, it happens to be a URL today, like a website address, like your blog, and being able to go to that website, prove that you are the only person who can really access or say
Control
this is
that.
my
Right.
account. and then go back to the other website and say, look, I just proved it. Here's proof, and so on.
And back to the idea of being really implementable and easy to work with. I mean, you can go and get up and running with OpenID in a few hours.
This is also true.
Good library support in lots of languages, and that goes to that engineering for adoptability thing,
Yeah.
right? It's not some huge stack and tool chain, and you don't have to get license any patents or any of that kind of stuff, right?
And I think that's a really big piece of why OpenID has seen adoption, is that it does try to solve sort of that one problem, but a very fundamental problem to the social web.
Well, but okay, so there's a little bit of pushback there, and I think it's valid pushback and criticism, and that's there's two pieces of it. One is that URLs are still fairly arcane and obtuse identifiers for people, where people don't necessarily represent themselves.
More
that
used to
way.
using an email address, for example. or
Yeah,
something.
people are
Yeah.
more used to signing up for a new service and handing over their email address as like the second step.
Go
no matter what.
verify. You get the email and you have to click
Even
on
if
it.
it's
That's
like
essentially equivalent to
pick
the
a username and choose a password. Once you've done that, the second step is like give us your email and now we'll validate that. So the point that I want to make about that though is that any type of identifier that is sort of exclusive to an individual that can be validated somehow externally, whether it's a phone number, you receive an SMS and you type that into a box on a website, or whether it's an email address, you receive an email and you prove that yes, I'm the only one that received that email, or it's an OpenID. I went back to this website, proved my little thing over there and went back. More and more, we're going to need different identifiers, I think, for the web that actually work with people. And so some of the things that are coming out of this are thinking about, how can we actually deal with this at web scale with technologies that people are already sort of used to, that don't make it super complicated, but yet allow them to have what you've sort of called durable identifiers that allows you to say, I represent my friend in this way, I think of my friend, or I know my friend uses Twitter a lot, this is their username, therefore that's how I represent them or identify them in my mind, and I want to connect with them.
If I want to say, well, Chris can see that, well,
Yeah,
which
right.
Chris?
How do you
right?
do that?
And-
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, David, you mentioned the building block in passing, OAuth, but we should probably take a minute to introduce that, explain it, and then how it fits with the others.
Sure. So actually, well, since I was sort of involved in that too, that actually came out of a shortcoming in OpenID. So this is something where I personally was trying to get Twitter to adopt OpenID, because yet again, I didn't want another account. And then Magnolia, another service, was already accepting OpenIDs to do sign-in. But of course, if you download like their dashboard widget or any like desktop application, of course, a lot of those applications didn't understand what an OpenID is, because of course there's no actual password for
They're
that.
just used to taking your
Yeah.
username
Your
and
password.
password,
And so
which has its own drawbacks, but at least it worked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The problem there is that every site that supported OpenID would essentially need to generate some kind of random password to go along with the OpenID.
Well, and that's what 37 Signals was doing.
That's right. Which is it basically is like a security through obscurity or through annoyance. I mean, it just really wasn't working well with the point of the protocol.
Security
which is
through annoyance. I like that.
Like here's
Good
my
bumper
identifier.
sticker.
Yeah. So I could break in, but it's such a pain. Like, forget it.
Well, actually, it's annoyance for the end user.
Yeah, right,
Because like,
right.
oh, now I have another
You have to,
random
like,
password.
break into your own house, right?
Basically.
Right, yeah.
So it was like, well, let's figure out a way of solving this so that we can do essentially what Flickr's done, where you don't put your username and password into these uploaders.
Well, and very much the idea is instead of going and turning OpenID into something much larger,
Right.
let's go and create two things which can work independently
That's right.
or can be combined.
I think there was a realization that there's really a separate building block. One is, how do I show you who I am? And the other one is, now that I've shown you who I am,
How do
I want to give you
authorize
some access to some
Right.
private data or to take some action on behalf. And that really is a sort of a downstream thing from showing you who I am in the first place.
All right, so at this point, we've got at least 3 building blocks that we've introduced: microformats, OpenID, and OAuth. And we all know there's a lot more of them that are coming into
Yeah.
existence.
Yeah.
And I think I see fodder for a future episode to explain each one of those. Maybe just before we go, a little bit of talk about that process of how these come about and some of the news of last week and the formation of the new organization, the Open Web Foundation.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that's been different for a lot of the communities which have been building things like microformats and OpenID and OAuth. I mean, there are a lot of other building blocks for the social web as well. We don't want to say that those are the only ones, but is that they come together out of a small group of people grabbing a random mailing list, working out of a random CVS or Subversion repository to control sort of changes to the specification itself. And they're moving very quickly. OpenID was about 3 years from when it was first written and deployed on LiveJournal to large companies like Google and AOL and Yahoo shipping support for it. OAuth then 2 years later took that down to 9 months between the spec being finished and Google shipping it. And if large companies get involved, they start to worry about intellectual property rights. And all of these communities start out by saying that the technology that they're creating is free. It should be freely implementable by anyone. I think Brad Fitzpatrick from OpenID said something along the lines of OpenID isn't owned by anyone because it benefits everyone on the web to have this.
Right.
And so now sort of how do we go back and retrofit this sentiment into something that's actually legally enforceable? And so each of these communities have been doing it in their own way. And this is really where the announcement last week came out of creating the Open Web Foundation. We're trying to go and create an environment that these communities can come together, can work in the same fashion of moving quickly, of being able to start out with a broad notion of we need to go and find a way to allow people to give access to their Magnolia bookmarks without giving away their password. And then get a spec, and at the end, have everyone involved say, we're not going to go and sue anyone for implementing this specification. And that's
I was just say it's funny how we're all sort of engineers by trade, and so it's very easy for us, well, relatively, to go in and figure out how should the spec look and how does it interoperable, but then to go figure out what sort of legal framework do I put around that so that big companies feel comfortable. And it's like we're not trained for that at all, right? And in fact, I remember for you how long you spent getting the OpenID stuff worked out. I mean, it's like that was like almost longer than writing the spec, right? Like,
yeah, and so I mean, we've now gotten to the point where we've done this a few times. We've done a foundation for OpenID. OAuth has been looking at what they're going to do. OpenSocial is creating a foundation right now. And so a group of us basically said, well, instead of creating another 6 nonprofits over the next year, let's try to create one. Let's try to use a lot of sort of the open source mentality that's gone into organizations like the Apache Software Foundation to very much do it in that fashion, that a wide community can go get involved, can produce great open specifications for the web.
And
Cool.
in a meta way, it's kind of another little building block that fits in. So it's almost like the
Well,
specs that it's
yeah.
representing.
I think
a legal building block.
Right, and which is essentially also learning from Creative Commons, which is also a type of building block that allows information, content, expression to flow more freely by sort of projecting in the future, saying, I would like anybody to be able to use these for these certain purposes, without having to go through a process of asking me
And
directly.
open source has a lot of those building blocks where they have things like Creative Commons for copyright licenses.
Yeah.
They have the open source initiative for defining what does it mean to be open source, what is an open source license.
Right.
They have Apache Software Foundation for the infrastructure for all that work. And now the open specification side sort of needs to catch up.
Cool. Well, obviously, there's a lot to talk about here. There's more building blocks for future shows. I think that this is a period of time that gives me hope as I see all these different grassroots efforts coming together, and I see essentially an acceleration in the pace of innovation around some stuff that is real pain points that need to get solved. So let's hope that episode 5 is not going to be called The Empire Strikes Back.
Yes. Although I do hope Chris will join us again next time.
Absolutely, that'd be great.
Love to.
So I hope you will join us next week as well on another episode of The Social Web Team.